Claire Donovan stood in the middle of the most expensive ballroom in Chicago, with red wine soaking through the white blouse of a schoolteacher who made $38,000 a year, and she didn't lower her eyes. 300 guests watched it happen. 300 glasses paused halfway to 300 mouths, and somewhere behind her a woman laughed the kind of soft, cruel laugh that travels farther than a scream, and still Claire didn't move. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run, to cover the stain spreading across her chest, to disappear the way poor people are supposed to disappear when rich people decide they've become inconvenient. She stayed, chin up, hands steady, glasses catching the light of a chandelier that cost more than her father's funeral. She was 27 years old. She taught English to 11-year-olds on the South Side. And she'd come to this wedding in the only decent outfit she owned, a pencil skirt and a white blouse and a worn blazer that couldn't quite hide the kind of figure the surgically improved women in that room had paid fortunes trying to buy. And maybe that was part of why the bride had, accidentally, tipped a full glass of cabernet down the front of her, and why the groom, the man who had loved her and kissed her good morning for 3 whole years, right up until her father died in disgrace 10 months ago, and her last name became a liability, stood 10 feet away and said absolutely nothing. He just watched. They all watched. Someone raised a phone and started recording, because that's what humiliation is now, content, and Claire Donovan stood alone in the center of it, wearing another woman's wine like a wound, understanding with terrible clarity that she'd walked into a room full of people who'd already decided exactly what she was worth. And then the room went silent. Not gradually, all at once, the way sound dies when something dangerous walks into a space and every animal instinct in every body registers it before a single mind catches up. He came through the crowd without hurrying, a tall man in a black suit that fit like it had been built around him, 37 years old, with a thin scar along his jaw and gray eyes that didn't soften when they looked at you, but didn't look through you either, and the crowd parted around him, the way crowds part around something they don't understand but instinctively recognize as serious. Half the room knew his name, and the other half knew enough not to say it out loud. Dario Falcone, the man the newspapers called the Falcon. The man whose family owned the docks and the unions and pieces of this city that didn't appear on any map, the most feared man in Chicago, and he wasn't looking at the bride, and he wasn't looking at the groom, and he wasn't looking at the 300 people, pretending they hadn't just watched a schoolteacher get destroyed for sport. He was looking at Claire. He crossed the entire ballroom, like the people between them were furniture, stopped in front of her, took the silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, and offered it to her with a stillness that made the whole room hold its breath. And then Dario Falcone, a man who'd never once been seen with a woman on his arm, a man who asked for nothing because he'd never needed to, leaned in close enough that only she could hear it, and whispered 6 words that would burn Claire Donovan's whole life down and build it back into something she never saw coming. Pretend you're the one I love. She should have said no. Any sensible woman would have said no. But across the room, the groom had gone pale. The bride's perfect smile had cracked at one corner, and in the far shadows a silver-haired man in an impeccable suit watched it all unfold over a glass of untouched whiskey, with the quiet, satisfied expression of someone who wasn't surprised at all. Because that man had known the Falcon was coming tonight, that man had been counting on it, and nothing that happened in that ballroom, not the invitation that shouldn't have been sent, not the wine, not the whisper, not what Claire said next, was ever really an accident. If you've ever been looked down on because of the size of your paycheck, hit that like button right now, because this story is for you. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that dignity can't be bought, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far Claire's story travels. And make sure you subscribe with notifications on, because you don't want to miss what this teacher does to the most powerful men in Chicago. Now, let's go back to the moment that wine left the bride's glass, and find out exactly how a schoolteacher ended up in the arms of a Mafia boss. 3 weeks before that fateful night, the wedding invitation arrived at the rented room in Pilsen, the way cruel things so often do, quietly, lying between the electric bill and a supermarket discount flyer. Claire recognized it even before she touched it. Thick cream-colored paper, gilded edges, the kind of paper people only used when money had stopped being a question. She stood in the narrow hallway, one hand still carrying a bag full of ungraded 6th grade tests, and read each raised line of print. Brandon Ashcroft and Bianca Sterling cordially request the honor of your presence at their wedding. Lakeshore Grand Hotel. Saturday evening. She read it twice, not because she didn't understand, but because there were kinds of pain that had to be confirmed by the eyes twice before the body would agree to believe them. Then she stepped into the room and placed the invitation on the chipped pressed wood table with exacting care, aligned to the smallest fraction, parallel with the edge of the table, as though setting it even 1 degree crooked would cause something inside her to break open. Molly Quinn came home from her night shift at the hospital, saw the invitation, saw Claire's face, and let out the one-word emergency room nurses, still used when the heart monitor took a plunge. For the next 3 weeks, the invitation remained exactly where it was, and Claire kept living the life the past 10 months had taught her how to live. She taught mornings at a public school on the South Side, tutored 2 extra students in the afternoons, and worked the weekend night register at a pharmacy on Cermak Avenue. 3 jobs to pay the rent on a room with a window facing a brick wall, because the small house with the white painted porch, where she had grown up, had been foreclosed by the bank 4 months after her father's funeral. Frank Donovan, who had spent 29 years as a city budget auditor, who had never once in his life filed a tax return late, had driven his car through a bridge railing on a September night, and before the dirt on his grave had even had time to harden, debts no one had ever heard of began springing up like mushrooms after rain, signatures that looked like his on papers he had never mentioned. And that word that began with the letter E, embezzlement, clung to the Donovans the way smoke clings to wool, impossible to wash out no matter how many times it is scrubbed clean. People couldn't put a dead man on trial, but they could make the dead man's daughter pay in his place. With glances at church, with phone calls declining her loan applications, with a man who had told her he loved her for 3 years suddenly needing time to think, then needing distance, then needing a wife with a different last name. Claire didn't allow herself to collapse, not because she wasn't in pain, but because she had calculated with brutal clarity that she couldn't afford to collapse. Breaking down was a luxury reserved for people with savings accounts. On the Friday night before the wedding, Molly sat on the old sofa, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold, watching Claire iron her clothes for the next day, and the battle she had held back for 3 weeks finally broke loose. "You can't go there, Claire. I can and I will. It's his wedding. Do you understand that? 300 of the richest people in this city are going to be there, and every last one of them knows who you are, knows about your father, knows about Brandon. They didn't invite you there to wish them well. They invited you there to watch." Claire folded the white blouse and smoothed the collar with 2 fingers, then let them watch. Molly set the teacup down hard on the table, tea sloshing onto her hand, though she didn't bother wiping it away. "Are you not hearing what I'm saying? These days people don't just watch anymore. They record. Someone is going to lift a phone at the exact moment you fall apart, and by the next morning, you'll be a video spreading all over the internet. The poor schoolteacher sobbing at her ex-lover's wedding. They'll film you crying, Claire." The room fell silent for 1 beat. Claire placed the folded blouse into a cloth bag, zipped it shut, and only then lifted her eyes to meet her friend's gaze directly. And when her voice came, it wasn't loud at all, but there was something in it that made Molly understand the argument had been over before it had even begun. "Then I won't cry." Molly opened her mouth, then closed it again. 6 years of sharing a room had taught her that Claire Donovan had a particular tone of voice, low, slow, flat, and still as the surface of a frozen lake, and when that tone appeared, every warning became nothing more than an echo. She only asked softly, almost in a whisper, "Why, Claire? What could you possibly gain by going there?" Claire stood beside the window, looking down at the street wet beneath the yellow lights, and answered in the voice of someone who had asked herself that question for 3 weeks and had found her answer. "Because I didn't do anything wrong. My father didn't do anything wrong. And if I hide in this room tomorrow night, then it means I agree with everything they've said about my family. I will go. I will sit up straight. I will congratulate the bride and groom, and I will leave whole. That is all I plan to do." She had no idea that on the other side of the city, in an office overlooking the dark harbor, a gray-eyed man was also holding an identical wedding invitation in his hand, an invitation for which he had never been on the official guest list. and wondering who had deliberately sent it to him and why. Bus number 60 dropped Claire 2 blocks from the Lakeshore Grand Hotel, and she walked the rest of the way in the twilight staining Lake Michigan purple because a taxi was $30, and $30 was a week's worth of food. She stopped for one breath before the row of gleaming brass-framed glass doors, where doormen in white gloves were opening cars whose yearly maintenance cost more than her salary, adjusted her eyeglasses, smoothed the front of her blazer, and stepped inside with the invitation in her hand like a thin shield. The man checking invitations in the lobby looked at her name twice, then looked at her once more from head to toe, his gaze lingering exactly half a second beyond politeness, before he inclined his head and invited her in. The ballroom opened before her like a world she had once almost belonged to, ceilings rising 30 feet high with 3 crystal chandeliers suspended overhead, white roses imported from Ecuador covering every table, a string quartet playing the kind of music no one listened to but everyone required, and 300 people wearing clothes worth an entire year of a teacher's salary standing in clusters, holding glasses of wine, smiling smiles they had practiced in front of mirrors. The whispering began before she had taken her first 10 steps. It wasn't loud. It was never loud. Chicago's upper class had elevated cruelty into an art of murmuring, but the shards still reached her ears like tiny pieces of glass. That's the Donovan girl, dear God. The daughter of the embezzler actually dared to come, who invited her, poor thing. Is she shameless or does she simply have nothing left to lose? Look at that outfit. She wore school clothes to a wedding at the Lakeshore Grand. Claire heard all of it. She had spent 3 weeks preparing for this, had told herself that words were only air trembling, but no preparation was enough. For the moment, a woman she had once called aunt, when she was 16, saw her, faltered in the middle of a sentence, then turned her back completely, as though Claire were a stain on the carpet. She found a place to stand near the windows overlooking the lake, far enough from the stage, close enough to the exit, and she had only just steadied herself when the scent of Chanel arrived before the voice did. Claire Donovan. Oh my heavens. It really is you. Patricia Holloway drifted toward her in an emerald silk dress, 54 years old, 3 strands of pearls circling her throat, the kind of woman whose compliment at a dinner table could open every club in the city, and whose raised brow could slam them shut forever. She took Claire by both shoulders, kissed the air 2 inches from her cheek, then stepped back to admire her the way one might inspect an auction piece. Look at you, so thin, but of course you are. I understand, after all those terrible things, your father, then the house, and then Brandon too. Why, there isn't a soul in this city who doesn't feel sorry for you. Her voice was sweet as syrup, and every word was placed with the precision of a needle. I must be honest, dear. You coming here tonight, I admire you for it truly. It takes courage, so much courage, to appear in a place where everyone knows your story. If I were you, I would never dare. But don't you worry. I don't believe you came here to make a scene the way people have been saying. Claire looked straight into those perfectly lined eyes and smiled, the same smile she used with parents who came to scold her because their children had received poor grades. I came to offer my congratulations, Mrs. Holloway. People are only afraid of crowds when they have something to hide, and I don't. Something flashed behind the bronze eyeshadow, a brief irritation that the needle had failed to pierce skin. Then Patricia laughed brightly, patted Claire's hand, said Claire had always been so sharp, and drifted away in search of prey that would bleed more easily. Claire let out a slow breath through her teeth, and then she saw Brandon. He stood 20 paces away, inside a circle of men in formal wear, his dark blonde hair expensively trimmed, the brand new wedding ring on the hand holding a glass of champagne, and for exactly 1 second, through the gap between 2 strangers' shoulders, their eyes met. 3 years of waking up beside each other shrank into that 1 second. Brandon was the one who looked away first. He turned his body slightly, only a few degrees, just enough for his back to say the words he didn't have the courage to say. And Claire stood there with the cold realization that the man who had once sworn he would protect her from the whole world now didn't dare protect her from a glance. At that very moment, the crowd in front of her parted, and the bride appeared. Bianca Sterling moved through the ballroom like a blade gliding across water. Her ivory wedding gown fitted to her flawless 24-year-old body, her platinum blonde hair swept high, and in her hand held, so carelessly it seemed almost deliberate, was a glass of cabernet filled nearly to the rim, wine as dark red as dried blood, a strange choice for a bride in white at her own wedding reception. She stopped in front of Claire, closer than etiquette allowed, pale blue eyes sweeping over her once, with a look that wasn't quite hatred, more like someone measuring an unknown quantity, and then her perfect lips curved. "Miss Donovan, I was afraid you wouldn't come," and the glass of wine in the bride's hand began to tilt. "Pretend you're the one I love." Those 6 words hung suspended in the 4 inches of air between them, and for several seconds that felt as long as an entire lifetime, Claire Donovan said nothing. She stood there with another woman's wine slowly cooling against the front of her blouse, with the silk handkerchief still resting on the outstretched palm of the most dangerous man in Chicago, and she did something perhaps no one in that ballroom had ever dared to do with Dario Falcone. She thought before answering him. The entire room held its breath and waited for her. 300 people who had just been laughing at her now stood motionless like wax figures, and she could feel the weight of every stare pressing down on her shoulders. Yet strangely, in the very moment when she was being watched more closely than she had ever been watched in her life, her mind became almost painfully clear. She lifted her eyes straight into the waiting gray ones, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear, but steady enough to surprise even herself. "That is a very strange offer from a man I've never spoken to." "Yes," he answered without blinking, without explaining himself, without stepping back. "You owe me an explanation." He tilted his head slightly, and something shifted behind those gray eyes, not exactly softening, more like a door opening by the narrowest crack. "I don't owe you anything yet," he said, "but I intend to. There are things happening in this room tonight that you don't know about, things that involve you as much as they involve me. I'll explain, but not here. Right now, I'm asking you for 1 hour. After that hour, you have every right to decide that I'm not worth another thought, and I'll accept that judgment without one word of complaint." Claire looked at him, then looked over his shoulder toward the far end of the ballroom, where Brandon Ashcroft stood frozen beside his bride with his face drained white, and she realized something that sent a chill down her spine. That man hadn't gone pale because of her. He had gone pale because he was afraid of the man standing in front of her, a naked fear she had never once seen on that face in all their 3 years of loving each other. She heard Molly's voice from the night before in her head. "They'll film you crying, Claire." She heard Patricia Holloway's syrup-sweet voice. "If I were you, I would never dare." She looked down at the dark red stain spreading across her white blouse like an open wound before 300 witnesses. Then she reached out and took the silk handkerchief. She didn't dab at the wine. Dabbing would be useless. Instead, she folded it into quarters with fingers that did not tremble, and when she spoke loudly enough for those standing nearest to hear every word. "1 hour," she said, "but first I want you to understand one thing, Mr. Falcone. I am not standing here tonight because I'm desperate. I am not accepting your offer because I have no other choice. I came to this wedding because I did nothing wrong. My father did nothing wrong, and I won't allow anyone's choices to turn me invisible. Do you understand me?" And that was when it happened, the moment Claire would later remember as the true beginning of everything. Something passed across Dario Falcone's face, the face the whole city believed showed no emotion. Something that wasn't surprise, something closer to recognition, the way a man looks when he hears something he has known for a long time finally spoken aloud by someone else for the first time. "Completely," he said. "Good," she replied, and placed her hand on the arm he offered, not with the tentative touch of a timid lady, but with decision, the way a person sets a pen to a contract. The arm beneath the black fabric was hard as oak and absolutely still, and together they turned and walked into the center of the ballroom. What happened next was something Claire would never forget, because it taught her more about human nature than the previous 27 years combined. The crowd opened before them like wax before fire. The people who had turned their backs on her 10 minutes earlier now bowed their heads in greeting as she passed. The woman Claire had once called Aunt, the same woman who had turned fully away when Claire walked in, now leaned toward her with a radiant smile and said, "Claire, darling, it's been so long," her sidelong glance toward the man whose arm Claire held impossible to hide. And in the far corner, Patricia Holloway stood frozen with her pearls, the folding fan in her hand slipping onto the carpet without her even noticing. Claire registered it all with a clarity that was almost merciless. None of them had changed the way they saw her. She understood that perfectly. They had only changed the way they saw the cost of insulting her, and those two things were worlds apart. Dario bent close to her ear, his voice barely audible over the music. "They're watching to see if you break." "I know," she said. "Don't give them that satisfaction. I never intended to." And as the string quartet began a new piece, as 300 pairs of eyes fixed themselves on the woman in a wine-stained blouse, walking on the arm of the Hawk of Chicago, no one in that ballroom, not even Claire herself, realized that in the shadowed corner at the end of the room, the silver-haired man beside the untouched glass of whiskey had pulled out his phone and typed a message of only 4 words. She took the bait. The first person to approach them was a heavy-set man in a tailored tuxedo that still looked as if it were squeezing him too tightly, his silver hair combed back, his smile stretched so wide it almost reached both ears. Trailing behind him, a wife wearing diamonds in every place diamonds could possibly be worn. "Falcone, what an honor. I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Gerald Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer of Whitfield Construction Group, whose name appeared on construction signs across half the city, extended a hand heavy with a gold ring and left it hanging in the air for exactly 2 seconds before Dario took it. A brief, dry handshake without a single degree of warmth. "Neither did I," Dario said, and Whitfield laughed far louder than the sentence deserved, the laugh of a man who wasn't certain whether he had just been greeted or insulted. Then his small eyes slid toward Claire, slid down to the wine stain on the front of her blouse, and Claire could clearly see the machinery of calculation behind that shiny forehead running at full power. Who is this girl? Why is the Hawk letting her hold his arm? How much should I wager on her? The calculation was complete in 3 seconds and produced its answer. And this must be the young lady the whole ballroom has been talking about, Whitfield said with a bow. Such a pleasure, Miss Donovan. Isn't it? My wife has always said young people these days simply don't have this kind of poise anymore. His wife nodded rapidly, her diamonds flashing. That's right, darling. The way you held yourself just now. Absolutely elegant. You and I must have lunch sometime. Are you free Tuesday, darling? Or Wednesday? Claire looked at this woman, the same woman whose whisper she had heard clearly behind her back 40 minutes earlier, wearing school clothes to the Lakeshore Grand. And she smiled. I'll have to check my schedule, Mrs. Whitfield. I've been rather busy lately. Busy, she thought, with 3 jobs, no less. The couple withdrew after exactly 4 minutes, making way for a thin man in a navy suit, the city councilman in charge of the Lakefront district, a man Claire remembered seeing on the local news, declaring that he would get tough on organized crime. Now standing before the boss of that very crime, with the posture of a schoolboy turning in a late assignment. He talked about a zoning bill, about the South Docks, about how his office had always valued the contributions of businesses like Mr. Falcone's to this city, and throughout those 3 minutes, Dario spoke a total of only 11 words, most of them words like, "Is that so? I understand, and I'll consider it." And yet the 8th most powerful man in Chicago still had sweat shining at his temples as if he were sitting through a job interview. Claire stood beside him, her hand still resting on Dario's arm, and observed it all with a strange clarity, almost detached, the clarity of a teacher standing at the back of a classroom watching her students during a test. With every person who approached, she registered the same sequence of movements, the fearful glance reserved for Dario, then the sudden warmth blooming toward her, a warmth that had not existed 1 hour earlier, then the careful retreat of people who had just placed a bet. And in her mind, a truth arranged itself with chilling precision. Power had not changed her. She was still Claire Donovan, earning $38,000 a year, with a wine stain on her blouse and $17 in her wallet. Power had only changed what these people were willing to see when they looked at her, and if one hand resting on one arm was enough to reverse the gaze of 300 people, then that gaze had not been worth a penny from the very beginning. She didn't know whether she should feel grateful or sick. Perhaps both. "You're quiet," Dario said between waves of guests, his eyes still facing forward. "I'm thinking. About what?" She accepted a glass of water from a waiter's tray and refused champagne with a slight shake of her head. "About whether any of this is real, or whether I'm only a prop in a play whose script I haven't been allowed to read." He was silent for a beat, and she realized he wasn't dodging the question. He was weighing it. "Both things are true," he said. "That answer isn't especially comforting. I didn't offer it to comfort you." He turned his head slightly, and for the first time that evening, She saw him look at the entire ballroom with a long, slow gaze, sweeping over the crystal chandeliers, the tables covered in white roses, the smiles rehearsed in front of mirrors. "I promised I would explain, and I keep my promises. But not here," he said, "because this is not a place where people have honest conversations. This is where people perform honesty for an audience. You've been watching it all evening. Don't ask me to perform one more act." Claire looked at him over the rims of her glasses and heard herself say what she was thinking before she had time to weigh it. "You speak like a man who has been disappointed by rooms like this before." "No," he replied. "I speak like a man who has watched them long enough." She was about to ask, long enough for how long, and what had forced him to observe instead of participate, but she did not have the chance, because at the edge of her vision, a patch of ivory was separating from the crowd and gliding toward them, moving with the icy precision of a swan cutting through frozen water, and Claire realized the bride was returning, this time without a glass of wine in her hand, carrying only a perfect smile and a pair of pale blue eyes, calculating something Claire had not yet deciphered. "Miss Donovan." Bianca Sterling stopped in front of them, with her hands loosely clasped before her ivory dress, her voice clear and sweet as the sound of a crystal bell. "I'm truly glad you stayed. I was afraid you might have left after that unfortunate incident earlier." Unfortunate incident. Claire let those two words rest between them for one beat, long enough for them both to know that they both knew, and then she smiled. "Congratulations on your wedding, Miss Sterling. Or no, I suppose Mrs. Ashcroft would be more proper now, wouldn't it?" Something flashed through those pale blue eyes at the sound of the new last name, too quickly to name, like a fish thrashing beneath a skin of ice, and then it vanished behind the perfect smile. "You're very generous," Bianca said. "Brandon used to tell me about you back then, I mean." She left the sentence hanging there one beat too long, long enough for it to cut. "I hope tonight hasn't been too difficult for you." "Not at all," Claire replied. Bianca's eyes left her and shifted to the man beside her, and Claire noticed a nearly invisible change in the bride's posture, her shoulders tightening slightly beneath the white lace, like a violin string being wound half a turn tighter. "Mr. Falcone, we didn't think you would come." "No," Dario said, and his voice had changed, still quiet, still composed, but something lay beneath that composure that hadn't been there when he spoke with the Whitfields, something that wasn't quite cold but stood very close to cold. "My plans changed." "My father would very much like to greet you," Bianca said. "He mentions you often. The South Harbor contract. I heard both sides still have a few matters left." "I don't discuss business at weddings," Dario cut in, not louder, not faster, simply placing a period in the middle of someone else's sentence and leaving it there. A silence followed. Of course, Bianca smiled, a smile so beautiful it deserved to be framed, and Claire didn't believe it for even 1,000th of a second. "I wish you and Miss Donovan a pleasant evening." Before turning away, the bride's gaze swept over Claire one last time, slowly, carefully, from the wine stain on her blouse up to the frames of her glasses. And in that gaze there was something that made Claire think of the way people looked at an unknown quantity in a problem they had not yet solved. Not hatred, not contempt, but calculation, appraisal, an attempt to place her into some box within a much larger equation Claire could not yet see in full. Then she drifted away, the white hem of her gown gliding soundlessly over the stone floor. "She's afraid of you," Claire said softly. "Bianca Sterling isn't afraid of many things in this world," Dario replied, his eyes still following the patch of white as it dissolved into the crowd. "She's calculating, and those are two different things." "Calculating what?" He didn't answer right away, and in that silence Claire learned something about him, that this man never spoke before deciding exactly how much to say. But the answer never came, because at that very moment a figure parted the crowd and approached them. A man about 45 years old, broad-shouldered, with short salt and pepper hair, dressed in a black suit, like every bodyguard in the room but moving like none of them, without a single wasted motion, and Claire realized he had been standing somewhere in the ballroom all evening, without her noticing him, which was precisely the most frightening thing about him. The man leaned close to Dario's ear and spoke in a low, quick voice for only about 10 seconds. Claire didn't hear a single word. But she saw Dario's face while he listened, and later, when she remembered that night, this would be the moment that made her shiver most. Not the wine stain, not the 300 staring eyes, but this face, because it didn't change, not one muscle twitching, not one breath falling out of rhythm, bad news pouring into that man like water onto granite. And that absolute stillness told her the seriousness of it more clearly than any burst of anger ever could. Griff, Dario said only one word, and the salt and pepper-haired man stepped back 3 paces and pulled out his phone. Dario turned to her. I have to go. What happened? Someone got into my office down at the harbor, he said. Papers were searched. He stopped, and she saw him weighing something behind those gray eyes. Then he drew a business card from the breast pocket of his jacket. Plain white, no logo, no title, only a name embossed into the paper and a phone number. He turned the card over, and she saw on the back, written by hand in black ink, the letters small, straight and exact as engraving, 4 words. Trust must be earned. He placed the card in her palm and closed her fingers around it, the first gesture all evening that crossed beyond the boundary of social formality, and his hand was strangely cold. I'll find you tomorrow morning, he said. But tonight, don't go anywhere alone, do you understand me? Why should I? I have nothing to do with your office or your papers. Just tonight, he said, more softly, and with such gravity there was no room left for questions. Promise me. Claire looked at the card in her hand, looked at the man who had stepped into her evening 2 hours earlier, and turned its entire architecture upside down without once asking whether she was ready. I promise, she heard herself say. He held her gaze for 1 more second, gave the faintest nod, then turned and walked toward the door with Griff close behind him, and the crowd parted before him automatically, like water before the bow of a ship, and within 30 seconds he was gone, and the Lakeshore Grand Ballroom with its 3 crystal chandeliers and 300 people suddenly seemed much smaller, as if someone had drawn a portion of the air out of the room. Claire stood alone in the emptiness he had left behind, the business card pressed tightly in her palm, and she had not yet decided what she should do next when she heard a voice behind her, a voice that for the past 3 years she had heard in both her best and worst dreams. Claire, she turned around. Brandon Ashcroft stood 3 steps away, no longer across the ballroom, no longer separated by any safe distance. Only him, close enough that she could smell the familiar old cologne, and his eyes were fixed on her with a tangled emotion she could not yet name. You really came, Brandon said, and his voice wasn't angry, wasn't cold, but bewildered. The genuine bewilderment of a man who had just discovered the world did not operate the way he thought it did, and somehow that was worse than contempt. I didn't think you would really come. Claire looked at him, the man in the wedding tuxedo with the boutonniere on his lapel already slightly wilted, and she noticed several people nearby beginning to tilt their heads toward them, the antennas of the upper class rising to sniff out a new scene. Not here, she said, and walked ahead into the side hallway off the ballroom, where marble columns and soft yellow light formed a pocket of silence, 1 wall away from the music. He followed. She stopped, turned, kept exactly 3 paces between them, and waited. I just wanted to say. Brandon lifted a hand and rubbed the back of his neck, the gesture she had seen 1,000 times in 3 years, the gesture he made whenever he had to say something difficult, and for 1,000th of a second it still hurt, like a nerve she had thought dead suddenly aching one final time. I didn't know Falcone would come tonight. You have to believe me. I had no idea. Why should that matter to me? Because people will talk, Claire. They're talking right now. You and him. The way he walked straight to you in front of everyone. You don't understand who that man is. He's dangerous. The stories people tell about the Falcone family. I just don't want your reputation to be, Brandon. She said his name very softly, very clearly, and he stopped as if the brakes had been pulled. Stop. The hallway was so quiet they could hear the music filtering through the wall like an echo from another world. My reputation, Claire said, each word set down slowly and straight as if she were laying stones, stopped being on the list of things you're allowed to have an opinion about 10 months ago. My evening is not your business. The person I stand beside is not your business. Where I go, who I trust, how I live, all of that moved beyond your boundaries the day you stood in my kitchen and said the situation had changed. Do you remember that day? I remember. You finished talking in 7 minutes and left in 15. I counted, you know. I sat in that kitchen and counted, because counting was the only thing that kept me from breaking apart in front of you. Brandon's face slowly whitened beneath the yellow light. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice dropping lower, but your father had just. The money scandal was everywhere. My law firm was about to review me for partnership. My family was pressuring me every day. You don't know how torn apart I was. I believe you, Claire said, and the strange thing was that she meant it. I believe you were torn apart. But after being torn apart, you still chose, Brandon, and you chose to let go of my hand in the very week I needed a hand more than I ever had in my life. That was your choice. You had the right to make it. I'm not standing here to collect a debt. But don't stand in front of me at your own wedding and put on concern for me like a borrowed coat. You're not worried about me. You're worried about how it feels to see me standing beside a man who isn't afraid of the things you're afraid of. Silence. Brandon looked at her with an expression she had never seen on that face in all 3 years they had been together. Not when he had nearly proposed, not when he had ended things. Something that looked like real shame, the kind of shame that cannot be performed. I did love you once, he said, the sentence slipping out more quietly than all the others. No matter what happened after, I want you to know that. I know, Claire said. It just wasn't enough. And she stood there for one more second, looking at the man who had once been the entire blueprint of her future, waiting for the familiar pain to surge up, the pain that had slept beside her for the past 10 months, but it did not come. Instead, there was something entirely different, still and distant, like passing the old house where you once lived after many years, and realizing the curtains had changed. The walls had been repainted, and that place, though it had once held your whole life, was now only an address. She thought, almost idly, so this is what falling out of love with someone looks like. I wish you happiness, Brandon, she said, and she walked away, not quickly, not slowly, her heels striking evenly against the marble, leaving behind the music, the crystal chandeliers, 300 people, and a version of herself that had been waiting in that ballroom for 10 months without her even knowing it. The night bus was nearly empty, and she sat in the last row, watching Chicago slide past the rain-streaked window, one hand gripping the business card in her pocket, as if it were a coal that was still warm. Molly was waiting in the doorway of their rented room, with her arms crossed over her chest, and her face balanced precisely between relief and readiness for battle. But after 1 second of looking at Claire's face, every prepared word she had collapsed. God, what happened to your blouse? It's a long story. Are you all right? Claire considered the question more seriously than Molly expected, thinking of the wine stain, of 300 gazes turning in the opposite direction, of Brandon beneath the yellow light, of a cold hand closing her fingers around a card. I think I am, she said. I think I'm better than I've been for the past 10 months. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the table with a cup of tea slowly going cold, the business card laid before her, turning it over and over beneath the desk lamp, one side bearing the name that made the whole city lower its voice, the other bearing 4 small handwritten words, straight and cold. Trust must be earned. Not a promise, not a flirtation, but something like the first clause of a contract the writer truly intended to honor, and the question that kept her awake until dawn was not what that man wanted from her, but something far more frightening. There are things happening in this room tonight that involve you as much as they involve me, he had said. And if that was true, then when had it begun? Sunday passed with nothing happening, no phone call, no one coming to find her. Tomorrow morning I'll find you turned out not to mean Sunday morning. And by evening Claire had almost convinced herself that the whole Saturday night affair had been a strange fever that would break on its own, until Monday morning, when real life pulled her awake at 5:30, the way it had every Monday morning for the past 4 years. The public elementary school where she taught stood between 2 old red brick buildings on the south side, behind a chain-link fence rusted through in 3 places, with a school sign missing 2 letters, a sign the administration had requested funding to replace 3 times and been refused 3 times. Her classroom was on the 2nd floor, 28 6th-grade students. A hole in the ceiling in the corner that dripped into a blue plastic bucket whenever the rain came hard, and a bookcase where 9/10 of the books had been bought with her own money at old book fairs, 50 cents or $1 each, collected little by little over 4 years like a bird carrying scraps back to its nest. She arrived 40 minutes before the students, as she did every day, brewed a pot of coffee in the teacher's lounge, and set a box of granola bars and a few bananas she had bought at the market the night before on the corner of her desk, saying nothing, labeling nothing, simply leaving them there, because she had learned long ago that in this neighborhood, a child's hunger was a secret guarded more carefully than adults guarded safes, and loud kindness was the kind of kindness that made them run away. Sam arrived first, as he did every Monday, 11 years old, thin, with messy brown hair and a coat whose sleeves had grown 2 knuckles too short at the wrists. He circled the corner of her desk twice, pretending to review the lesson on the board, before slipping 1 granola bar away with the speed of a magician, and Claire busied herself wiping the board so she would see nothing at all. That was the wordless agreement between teacher and student that had held perfectly for a year. Except this morning she noticed he took 2 bars, which meant there had been nothing to eat at home again over the weekend. Her Monday morning language arts period was story reading, and she was listening to Sam read aloud to the class from a used book that had cost $1, stumbling over words but filled with determination, the whole class silent with each line. Moments like that being the reason she had stayed on for a salary of $38,000. When the classroom door opened and the principal stood there with the face of someone who had just finished reading a sentence of condemnation. At recess, the teacher's lounge buzzed like a broken hive around a notice. The City Board of Education had placed the school on a list for possible closure at the end of the school year. The official reason was declining enrollment and maintenance costs, but the math teacher slammed the Chicago Tribune down on the table, pointed at the real estate page, and said the real reason was right here. This whole stretch of land had been rezoned. Sterling Group had been buying up 3 rows of buildings around the school since last year. They were calling it a riverfront redevelopment project, 9 luxury apartment towers, a shopping center, and this school sat right in the middle of their blueprint like a thorn. Claire held the newspaper and stared at the rendering of gleaming glass towers printed over the neighborhood, where her 28 students lived, and she felt an old anger rise in her. The anger of someone accustomed to watching the things she loved being priced by people who would never set foot inside them. School ended at 3:15, and she carried a stack of tests toward the gate, her head still spinning between the notice and Sam's 2 granola bars. So she had crossed nearly the whole schoolyard before she saw it, and when she saw it, she froze in the middle of the yard. Beyond the rusted chain-link fence, parked along the curb among the neighborhood's worn-out cars like a black panther lying among stray cats, was a black Mayock polished so deeply it reflected the clouds overhead, and leaning against its door, still in a black suit, still with that same stillness, was the man she had spent the past 48 hours trying to convince herself had been a fever. Students poured through the gate and looked back at the car, a few parents waiting for their children instinctively stepping back half a pace, and Griff, standing 10 feet from the car with the posture of a utility pole that knew how to observe, gave her a slight nod. Claire crossed the street, holding the stack of tests against her chest like a paper shield. "You said tomorrow morning," she said. "Today is Monday." "I said tomorrow morning, but I needed 1 more day," Dario replied, and she noticed something different about him from Saturday night, the lines of him unchanged, but beneath them a layer of fatigue the afternoon light exposed. This man had not slept much more than she had. "I apologize for coming to your school. I know it is improper, but this cannot wait until tonight." He opened the car door, not as an order, but as a question made by gesture, and stood still, waiting for her to decide. Claire looked at the car worth 15 years of her salary, looked at the school about to be erased from the map behind her, looked at the man waiting with the patience of stone. "I have tests to grade," she said. "I'll have you home before 6. What do you need to talk about that cannot wait?" And Dario Falcone looked at her across the roof of the black Maybach, the slanting afternoon light, passing through the rusted fence and laying bars of brightness and shadow across his face, then spoke in the quiet, level voice she would hear again in her mind on many nights to come. "Miss Donovan, your father's death was not an accident. The world shrank until it was exactly the size of the distance between her and the man on the other side of the car roof. The sound of students calling to one another outside the gate, the sound of the bus pulling away from the stop, all of it receded as if someone had turned down the volume, and Claire heard her voice coming from some very calm place she had not known she possessed. "Say that again." "Your father's death was not an accident," Dario repeated, each word no faster, no softer, "and I can prove part of it. For the rest, I need your help." She got into the car, not because of the Maybach, not because of him, but because her 2 knees had just informed her they would not be able to hold her upright much longer, and she would rather sit down on leather then collapse in the middle of the schoolyard in front of her students. The car rolled forward with an almost absurd smoothness. Griff was driving, the partition glass rose between the front and back seats, and inside that silent box wrapped in leather, Dario Falcone began to speak, without preamble, without asking whether she was ready, as if he understood that with things like this, waiting until a person was ready meant never speaking at all. "I have a younger brother," he said. "His name was Michael. The whole family called him Mickey. He was 8 years younger than me, the only one in the Falcone family who had never touched the dark side of the family business. I kept him clean. That was the only thing I managed to do for my mother before she died. He studied finance. He believed in numbers. He told me numbers didn't lie, only the people who used numbers lied. 3 years ago, he was auditing the books for the family's legal construction division, and he found something he shouldn't have found. Strange money moving through the contracts of a major partner, material invoices for projects that didn't exist. Money going in clean through one door, and then coming out through another, and every one of those streams led back to the same name. From the beginning, his voice had been as level as a highway, and Claire, sitting half a yard away from him, realized that the evenness itself was the frightening thing. Because it wasn't calm. It was a structure built to hold something else down. "Mickey didn't tell me," Dario continued. "He was afraid I would handle it my way. He wanted to do it right. He arranged to meet someone, alone, to ask for clarity. 3 days later, they found him in an apartment on the west side, with a needle on the floor, and enough drugs in his blood for the conclusion to be reached in 20 minutes. Overdose. The file was closed within a week. My brother Dario said, and here, on that one word, brother, his voice cracked. A hairline fracture across glass, sealing itself again in the very next instant. But Claire had seen it, and she understood that she had just been shown something perhaps no living person outside of him had ever seen. My brother had never even managed to smoke one cigarette in his life. He hated the smell of smoke. He was 26 years old. The car turned along the lakeshore, the gray-silver water spreading beyond the window, and Dario let the silence stand between them for a long stretch before he went on. "It took me 1 year to prove he had been murdered, 2 more to trace every line of money, every intermediary name, every shell company, and all of it, led back to the same place Mickey's numbers had pointed. Then 8 months ago, while I was reviewing other victims of the same network, people who had stood in the way of that money and then met with accidents, I found a name that made me stop. Frank Donovan, city budget auditor." He turned to look at her for the first time since the car had started moving. "Your father was the man who approved payment files for publicly funded projects, and last summer, he blocked a series of invoices from that exact chain of companies. Fraudulent invoices for materials no one delivered to construction sites no one built. He didn't just block them. He started asking questions, sent written requests for explanations, followed procedure, followed the law, like a man who had believed in procedure and law his entire life. 6 weeks later, his car went through a bridge railing on a night with no rain, on a stretch of road he had driven for 29 years. And within 4 months after the funeral, the debts you know better than I do began to appear. Papers with signatures that looked like his, creditors no one had ever heard of, until the house was gone, the name was gone, and all this city remembered of Frank Donovan was a word that began with the letter E. They didn't only kill him, Miss Donovan. They killed his name too, so no one would care enough to ask again why he died." Claire sat motionless. She heard all of it, every word entering her like cold water seeping through a clenched hand, and hundreds of things rose in her chest at once. 10 months of glances at church, rejected phone calls, signatures that looked like her father's on documents she had held, with trembling hands in a lawyer's office. Her father, the man who sorted bills by folder color, the man who had never missed a deadline in his life. They had told her he had become careless at the end because he was falling apart, and she had almost believed it. God forgive her. There had been nights when she had almost believed it. She did not cry. Tears were something she had learned to postpone for the past 10 months, postpone until they became less expensive. She looked out at the gray lake for a long while, then turned back to look straight into the waiting gray eyes and asked exactly one question, her voice low and sharp as a blade freshly honed. "What do you need from me?" "Your father's papers," Dario said, without circling around it, as if he had been waiting for that exact question. "Anything left after the creditor swept through, ledgers, letters, Bills, notes, especially anything from the final year of his life. If he had started asking questions, then for a man like him, asking questions meant taking notes. And in those notes there may be something I've spent 3 years looking for and still haven't found. A link connecting the money flow to a specific name. Something solid enough to take higher than the reach of the person behind it. And the person behind it is someone you still don't intend to name for me, Claire asked. Not yet, he answered, not because I don't trust you, but because that name is the kind of information that is more dangerous to know before you have protection than not to know at all. You'll have it, I promise, but in the right order. Claire looked at him for a long while, weighing that logic, finding it both arrogant and so tightly constructed that it was hard to argue against, and decided to let it pass, for now. Then listen to me, she said. I'll show you all of my father's papers, but I have conditions. I'm not a filing cabinet for you to open. Take what you need and close again. If I'm involved, then I'm fully involved. You tell me what you have, what you're looking for, and anything that concerns my father I hear it first. Not the shortened version, not the version edited for faint-hearted women, the full version. Dario looked at her with an expression she was beginning to learn how to read. The look of a man who had just revised every prediction he had made about the conversation. Do you understand what you're asking for? He said. This isn't a paperwork dispute or a civil lawsuit. This person has killed at least 2 people that I can prove, and most likely didn't stop at 2. If he finds out you're digging, he already knows about me, Claire cut in, and her voice did not rise, but it hardened. I stood beside you for 2 hours in front of 300 people on Saturday night. My picture may be sitting on his desk right now. I may not know what I am yet, but I'm certainly no longer invisible. So the question isn't whether I'm involved or not. The question is whether I'm involved with information or involved blind, and I choose information. Silence stretched in the car for 3 seconds. Then Dario nodded, a slow nod, and said, All right, but now I have one condition of my own. If we reach a point where the danger to you exceeds my ability to shield you, you withdraw completely, no argument. Claire narrowed her eyes. And who decides when that point has come? She asked. You, she saw it, as clearly as watching a wave stop halfway to shore. His first instinct was to say, yes, I decide. It had risen all the way to his tongue, and he stopped it, swallowed it down, and when he opened his mouth, what came out was a different word. Both of us, he said. We decide together. She understood with the instinct of someone who had spent her whole life watching other people, that the word had cost him more than everything else he had said since that afternoon began. Then we have a deal, she said, and held out her hand. Not a polite social offering, but straight, decisive, across the space between the 2 leather seats. He looked at that hand for 1 beat, then took it. 1 firm, brief squeeze, the handshake of 2 people who had just signed their names, and she realized his hand was no longer as cold as it had been on Saturday night. Her rented room in Pilsen made the Maybach look like a staging error, and Claire felt a small, almost childish satisfaction when the man who owned half of Chicago's harbor had to duck his head to avoid the low beam at the foot of the stairs. Molly was working the afternoon shift. The room held only the 2 of them, and Claire pulled 2 cardboard boxes with frayed corners from beneath the bed. Everything the creditors left behind. They took the house, the car, even his watch, she said, but they didn't want the paper. Paper can't be sold. They sat down on the wooden floor, 2 people, 2 boxes of papers, the late afternoon light turning yellow on the wall, and began. Dario worked in a way that astonished her, not flipping through pages so much as scanning them, his eyes running over each sheet for only a few seconds without missing anything, pausing from time to time to place 1 page in a separate stack without explanation, and she realized he was checking every number against a database that existed entirely inside his head. 3 years of relentless work compressed into that memory, and Claire reread pages she had once read through tears 10 months earlier. And this time, with what he had told her, the old words rearranged themselves into new meaning, expenses her father had underlined, question marks he had written in pencil in the margins. She had thought they were signs of a mind falling apart. Instead, they were the tracks of a man following something, alone in silence, so he would not drag his daughter into it. Night fell without either of them noticing. The desk lamp had been pulled down to the floor. The 2 cups of tea Molly had left were empty. And near 8 o'clock, when Claire turned over a payment contract copy, dated last August near the bottom of the 2nd box, Her eyes slid across the left margin and then stopped. There, written in pencil, so faint she had to tilt the paper beneath the light to see it, in her father's small, straight handwriting, the handwriting she could recognize among 1,000, was one single line, SG-Pier 9. Ask K. Claire did not breathe for 2 seconds. Dario, she said softly. He looked up, followed her finger, and she saw his entire body go still in the way the surface of a lake goes still before a storm. SG, she read. Pier 9, ask K. She lifted her eyes to him. Who is K, Dario? And for the first time since she had known him, Claire saw Dario Falcone hesitate. K. Dario said after a long stretch of silence, could be one of 3 people. And if it is the person I am thinking of, then your father got closer than anything I had imagined. But he did not have time to finish, because outside, the rain that had grown heavy without either of them noticing was suddenly torn open by a pounding at the door. Not knocking, pounding, urgent, panicked. The kind of sound that made Dario spring to his feet and place himself between Claire and the door. So quickly she didn't even see him move, one hand already slipping inside his suit jacket. Who is it? He asked, his voice flat. From the hallway came a girl's voice, young, broken, drenched. Miss Donovan. Please, is Miss Donovan home? I'm Abby Shaw. I worked as a server at the wedding on Saturday. Please open the door. Claire looked at Dario. He gave the slightest nod, and she opened it. Standing in the dark hallway was a girl of about 21, rain-soaked hair plastered to her pale cheeks, her thin coat dripping onto the floor, both arms wrapped tightly around herself, trembling not from the cold. And when she saw Dario behind Claire's shoulder, the girl let out a breath like a long-distance runner finally touching the finish line. Thank God, I went to 3 places. I didn't know where to find you, people said. People said you left with the teacher at the wedding. I only remembered her name from the seating chart. I'm sorry, I didn't know where else to go. Come in, Dario said, not an invitation, a decision. Abby stepped inside. Claire locked the door twice, by instinct, and saw Dario register the gesture with a quick glance. Molly, who had come home from her afternoon shift 10 minutes earlier, appeared in the kitchen doorway, assessed the situation in exactly 4 seconds, with the eyes of an emergency room nurse, then turned back without a word and returned with a dry towel and a cup of hot tea. Abby held the cup in both hands as if clinging to the only floating thing in the current. Tell me, Dario said, sitting across from the girl, leaning forward, both elbows on his knees. No preamble, no intimidation, bare command delivered in a low voice. What did you see? What did you hear? In order. Abby swallowed hard. Saturday night, after the reception ended, we were cleaning the ballroom. It was almost 1 a.m. when the manager sent everyone home, but I went back to get my phone. I had left it in the East Wing hallway, and I saw cars arrive, 3 of them, all the headlights off. They came in through the east door, the staff entrance, and I hid behind a linen cart because I was scared. I don't know why I was scared, but my feet just moved on their own. The girl took a sip of tea, her teeth clicking against the rim of the cup. The man who came in was Mr. Sterling, the bride's father. I recognized him because he gave a speech during the reception. He came with 3 men I had never seen before. And the groom, Mr. Ashcroft, came out to meet them in the hallway. And his face, I've never seen anyone look like that at his own wedding, like someone called up to the blackboard without having studied. They went into the small meeting room at the end of the hall. The door didn't close all the way. There was still a crack, and I knew I shouldn't, but I heard your name, Mr. Falcone. Mr. Sterling said your name first. Go on, Dario said, still not moving. He said. Abby's voice dropped into a whisper, as if the words themselves might hear her. He said your coming to the wedding had changed the timetable. Then he asked what Mr. Ashcroft knew about the teacher. Mr. Ashcroft stammered something I couldn't hear clearly. And then Mr. Sterling said the sentence that, I'm sorry, Miss Donovan. I'm only repeating it exactly, he said. The Donovan girl is a variable that needs to be handled. The room went utterly still, with only the sound of rain striking the window panes. Then one of the 3 men said something about how the girl lived in Pilsen, that they knew the address, and then I heard a chair scrape, so I ran. I went home. I didn't dare leave the house all day Sunday. I meant to pretend I hadn't heard anything, I really did, but tonight I kept thinking that if something happened to her, and I had stayed silent, then so I went looking. I'm sorry it took me this long. You have nothing to apologize for, Claire said softly. Dario stood and walked to the window, not to look out. Claire was beginning to understand, but because his body needed movement when his mind was running at full force. He stood there for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. 4 seconds, then turned back, and every decision had already been made. "Do you have family out of town?" he asked Abby. "My sister is in Milwaukee. Griff will take you to the bus station tonight," he said, drawing an envelope from the inner pocket of his suit jacket, counting out a stack of cash without looking and pressing it into the girl's hand. "Bus fare, a month's rent. Don't go back to work for your things. Don't post anything online. Don't tell anyone but your sister where you are, and in 1 month someone will tell you when it's safe to return." Abby looked at the money. "I can't take this." "You can and you will," Dario said, his voice unchanged, but with something beneath it that made the girl stop arguing. "You just did something brave. Don't make it the last brave thing you ever do by going back somewhere unsafe." He sent a message. 30 seconds later, they heard a car stop below on the street, and when the door closed behind Abby, he turned to Claire, and she already knew the next sentence before it came. "You and Molly pack your things, 10 minutes, he said. "Neither of you is sleeping here tonight." Claire folded her arms. "I'm not leaving my home, Claire. This is my home," she said, and she heard 10 months of loss gathering in her own voice. "They took the house where I grew up, took my father's name. These 4 rented walls are all I have left. I'm not running." Dario looked at her, and instead of giving an order, he did something she hadn't expected. He lowered his voice. "I'm not asking you to run," he said. "I'm asking you not to stand exactly where they have marked you. Just tonight. The people named in that testimony know this address, and I need you alive to finish with me what we began this afternoon. You told me you were fully involved. People who are fully involved don't hand their enemies a stationary target." Molly, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, with the face of someone who had just understood whose sights the room she lived in had fallen into, spoke first. "I'm getting my bag," and Claire stood in the middle of the room for 2 more seconds, looking at the 2 boxes of her father's files on the floor, then bent down and lifted the first box. "The papers come with me," she said. "Of course," Dario replied, and outside the window, beneath the curtain of rain, a second car had already been waiting. The second car carried Molly and 2 suitcases packed in haste, while Claire sat in the Maybach with her father's box of files on her lap, holding it with both arms as though holding a child, watching Pilsen recede behind the rain through the bulletproof window. The late-lit grocery stores, the Mexican bakery on the corner, the small world that had sheltered her for the past 10 months, and she wondered when she would be allowed to return, or whether she would be allowed to return at all. Griff drove north through the city, the downtown lights smearing into streams of color down the wet glass, and inside the silent car, Dario spoke. "There's something I haven't shown you." She turned to him. He drew a folded sheet of paper from the inner pocket of his suit jacket, sealed inside a clear plastic bag, the kind used for evidence, and handed it to her. "Whoever got into my office Saturday night didn't take anything," he said, "because what he was looking for wasn't there. But he left something behind, deliberately, right in the center of my desk, pinned beneath the paperweight, to make certain I couldn't miss it." Claire held the plastic bag by the tips of her fingers, carefully, as though holding something that might explode, and tilted it toward the streetlight bleeding through the window. On the plain white paper, in handwritten capital letters, even and lifeless like the writing of a right-handed person using his left hand, were 2 sentences. "You have until Friday. After that, the girl becomes evidence." She read it once, then she read it again. Rain tapped steadily against the roof of the car, and she heard her own heartbeat slow in a strange way, as if her body had decided panic was a luxury not included in the budget. "Friday," she said. "Today is already Monday night." 4 days, Dario said. "The girl is me, yes. Becomes evidence." She turned the plastic bag over, looking at the 2 sentences from the other side, as if hoping they would change meaning. "What does that mean, Dario? Evidence of what?" He was silent for a while, and she recognized that silence, the space in which he weighed the version that would comfort her against the version that was true. And she had also come to understand, in 2 short days, that when she looked directly at him and waited, he would choose the truth. She looked directly at him and waited. "He is setting a price for me," Dario said. "If by Friday I don't stop the investigation, don't hand over what I have and step back, he won't kill you. Killing you now would be too loud, with too many eyes watching after Saturday night. Instead, he'll do what he does best, what he did to your father. He'll build you into a criminal. A file is being prepared. I would guess it's nearly finished. a complete set of papers proving that Frank Donovan was not a victim of the money laundering network but its architect, that he didn't block the fraudulent invoices but created them himself. Real signatures mixed with forged ones, ghost accounts opened in his name years ago. The dead can't defend themselves. You know that better than anyone. And you, his voice slowed by half a beat, as if this part was harder to say. You are the piece that makes the story perfect. The daughter inheriting her father's work. He'll route money through the only things you have the right to touch. Your classroom parent fund. The book fund you raise for your students. The fundraising account to repair the school. A few backdated transactions. A few scanned signatures. And by Saturday morning all of Chicago will be reading that a schoolteacher embezzled charity money from poor children, following in the footsteps of her fraudster father. Claire sat motionless. Of everything she had imagined over the past 2 hours, guns, cars following them, men in the rain, she had not imagined this, and it struck the target more cleanly than all the rest combined, because a gun could only take her life, but this would take the thing she had spent 10 months of hell trying to keep. She thought of Sam and the granola bar, of the 28 children who trusted her, of the parents who had contributed crumpled $5 bills to the book fund, and imagined their eyes when they read that story. It wasn't the courtroom that frightened her, it was their eyes. He doesn't mean to kill me, she said softly. He means to do something worse. He means to turn me into my father in the eyes of the whole city, another Donovan name buried without the need to dig a grave. Yes, Dario said, and in that blunt little word she heard a strange respect. He did not put an arm around her to comfort her, did not say everything would be fine. He only confirmed the truth for her, the way one confirms it for an equal, and that, strangely enough, steadied her more than any reassurance could have. She set the plastic bag down on the seat between them, squarely, neatly, a small gesture of arranging the world back into order through small objects. Then we have 4 days to find whatever is in these papers before he can release the forged file, she said, and her voice had returned to her classroom voice, clear, organized, dividing the work. But there is one thing I still don't understand. He left this note in your office on Saturday night, which means the break in order had to be given before or just as you appeared at the wedding. A reaction that fast, unless. She stopped, and Dario nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for her to reach that wall on her own. Unless he knew beforehand that I would be there, he said. And that is exactly the problem, Claire. I made the decision to attend that wedding only 3 days earlier. No announcement, no official invitation. Only 4 people in this world knew I would be at the Lakeshore Grand on Saturday night. 4 people I trusted with my life. He turned to look straight at her, and the streetlight swept across his gray eyes, making them gleam like cooled steel. One of those 4 people is working for Sterling. Dario's penthouse took up the entire top floor of a building overlooking the Chicago River. And the first thing Claire noticed when she woke on Tuesday morning in the guest room set aside for her was not the luxury, but the silence. The walls here swallowed sound like fresh snow, an entire tower, designed so no one could hear anything and nothing could escape. Molly had gone to her morning shift, with a guard sitting 3 rows ahead of her, on the train without her knowing it, while Claire called the school and requested her first 2 sick days in 4 years, and the principal, still dazed by the closure notice, approved without asking a single question. All that day, Claire witnessed something she would never forget, the way a man hunted a traitor inside his own house. 4 people knew I was going to the wedding, Dario said beside the long dining table covered with papers, not her father's papers, his, my driver, my lawyer, Griff, and my chief financial officer, the man who has worked for this family since I was 15. He laid 4 business cards on the table, like 4 face-down playing cards. Today, each one of them will receive an urgent piece of information from me, something that appears accidental, about where I am keeping the evidence, and each will receive a different version, 4 different locations. Then we wait to see where Sterling sends his people. Whichever canary sings, we'll know which cage opened. He finished explaining in 3 sentences and did not repeat himself. The rest of the day was made of phone calls delivered in a voice so ordinary it chilled the skin. I need you to look over the contract at the West Warehouse. And while you're there, actually, never mind, it's nothing. Pieces of information dropped like bait into dark water, each one carrying a different scent, and Claire sat at the other end of the table with her father's files, looking up at him between calls, seeing a man forced to weigh every word he spoke to people he had once trusted with his life, and understanding that in this sound swallowing room, the thing slowly dying all that day was not Sterling's plan, but some part of Dario Falcone. By evening, both of them were wrung dry. Frank Donovan's papers had been divided into 3 stacks on the table, reviewed, suspicious, untouched. The line SG Pier 9 Ask K had been photographed, enlarged, and taped to the glass, and K remained a silent letter because Dario said any name at this point would be guessing, and guessing was a luxury they couldn't afford. Molly came home, ate dinner, and went to bed early with the eyes of a woman who had decided she would panic some other time. Near midnight, Claire couldn't sleep, so she went out to the living room for water and found him still there, standing before the glass wall, the lights off, only the glow of the city rising from 30 floors below, his jacket removed, white shirt sleeves rolled up, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw that those shoulders were not completely straight. "You should sleep," she said. "I don't sleep much," he answered without turning around, "a bad habit since I was 23. She came to stand beside him, one arm's length away, and the two of them looked down at the city glittering with lies below, all those warm yellow dots of light, and somewhere among them, a man preparing a file to bury her name. "Of those 4 people," she asked softly, "who do you hope it isn't most?" The silence stretched so long, she thought he would not answer. "All of them," he finally said, "but if you're asking who I fear it is most, then it is the man who carried me out of the church the day my father was shot at the gate. I was 15. He shielded me with his own body, without thinking for even 1 second. He said it in a voice as level as a weather report, and Claire, after 3 days, knew what that level voice meant. It was the thinnest skin of ice over the deepest lake. She took a sip of water. "You know," she said, "my students think my eyesight is terrible, but actually my prescription is light. I could wear contacts, but I like the glasses. When I first started teaching, I discovered that when I wore glasses, the children and even the parents looked at me differently, more seriously, as if I were harder to bully. So I wore them every day like armor. For the past 10 months, I even wore them just to go to the laundromat." She felt his gaze leave the city and settle on her. "You wear those glasses like a shield," he said. "And you wear silence like a shield," she replied, without looking back. "We just use different materials." The distance between them was 12 inches. She measured it with a sense she had not known she possessed. 12 inches of air suddenly thickening, like water, and she could hear her own breathing, could hear the city humming far below beyond the glass, and for about 3 seconds that stretched as long as 3 seasons, neither of them moved. Neither of them crossed those 12 inches. Because both of them knew, without needing to say it, that anything beginning in a week like this one would forever carry the scent of fear, and both of them wanted, if there was to be something, for it to begin somewhere cleaner. Dario stepped back first, half a step, and that retreat was as formal as a bow. "Go to sleep, Claire," he said. "Tomorrow is Wednesday, and Wednesday will be long." She returned to her room and lay staring at the strange ceiling until 2 in the morning, and she had barely drifted off for what felt like 10 minutes when a knock sounded at the door, 3 urgent taps, and Griff's voice came from the hallway. "Miss Donovan, he needs you in the living room." One of the birds in the cage just sang. The living room at 2 in the morning was lit by only 1 lamp, and Dario stood in the middle of that pool of light with his phone in his hand, the screen still glowing, his face something Claire had never seen before, not anger, because anger still carried heat. This was something that had passed to the other side of anger, cold and still as the bottom of a well. Half an hour ago, the motion cameras at the West Warehouse recorded 2 men cutting the lock and searching the place, he said, his voice no louder than the air conditioner. "The West Warehouse was the location I gave to only 1 person. He turned the phone screen toward her, and on it, frozen in a black and white frame, were 2 gloved figures prying open an empty safe. "Who?" Claire asked, though her stomach already knew the answer from his eyes. "Leonard Voss," Dario said. "My chief financial officer, 15 years, the man who carried me out of the church." The name fell into the room and lay there. Claire remembered the night before, beside the glass wall, the thing he had said about the man who had shielded a 15-year-old boy with his own body, and she understood that fate had just chosen the cruelest answer among the 4. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly. Dario looked at her for a long while, then said, "Tomorrow morning he'll come here according to his usual work schedule. and I want you in the inner room with the door nearly closed. You'll be able to hear everything. I want you to hear it, because you are one half of this agreement, and you need to know what kind of man I am when the door closes. After tomorrow morning, if you want to walk away, I'll understand." At 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning, Leonard Voss entered the penthouse with the leather briefcase that had followed him for 20 years, a 60-year-old man with silver at his temples, his back still straight, and Claire, watching through the crack of the study door, saw the moment he froze when he realized that on the long dining table there was no coffee and no report the way there had been every Wednesday morning for 15 years. Only a phone lying in the center of the table, its screen playing the West Warehouse footage, and beside the phone a black handgun. No one said anything for 10 seconds. Then Voss set the leather briefcase down on the floor, slowly, neatly, with the gesture of a man who had just understood that every road had closed, and sat in the chair across from Dario, both hands placed on the tabletop open, so Dario could see they were empty. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since 2 this morning," Dario replied. "You were the only person I told about the West Warehouse. I gave you a separate name, a separate address, a separate trap, and you carried it straight to Sterling." Voss closed his eyes for 1 second, and when he opened them, Claire saw in them not denial, but a weariness that had been gathering for a very long time. "Peter," he said, only those 2 words, and then stopped, as if he had to gather momentum. "My son. 14 months ago, he drove home from a party after drinking, on Route 41 through Highland Park, and there was a man walking his bicycle along the shoulder. He called me at 3 in the morning, and I, Dario, I did the thing I have cursed myself for every day since. I called someone I knew to clean it up, and that person turned out to be working for Sterling. 3 weeks later, Walter Kane was sitting in my living room with a file of photographs from the scene and a recording of Peter's call. And from that day on, I was their puppet. He is my only son. Do you understand? He was about to have his first child. He did not beg, did not kneel. He sat upright and confessed the way a person pulls shards of metal from his own flesh. I told Kane you were going to the wedding. I told him you were getting close to the money trail. Last night I passed along the information about the West Warehouse. Each time, I told myself it would be the last time, and each time there was another time after it. That is how it works. They don't buy people. They rent their debts." Silence settled over the room. Claire, behind the crack in the door, looked at Dario, and she saw his hand settle on the gun on the table. The whole room held still. "I owe you a life," Voss said, his voice strangely calm. "Collect it," and Dario Falcone, the most feared man in Chicago, picked up the gun. Claire heard her heart stop. Then he pushed it toward the edge of the table, away from both of them. The barrel turned toward the wall, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to hold her breath to hear every word. "You carried me 200 yards through gunfire when I was 15, he said. "Since 2 this morning, I've been trying to decide which debt weighs more, that one or this one, and I can't measure it, so I'm done measuring. Listen carefully, because I'll say this once. From this minute on, you work for me again, but Kane and Sterling will not know that. To them, you remain theirs. You will pass them what I want them to hear, and you will bring me everything they say, every name, every meeting, every paper. That is the only way you can redeem the last 14 months, and it is also the only way to save Peter. Because when Sterling falls, and he will fall, every puppet he owns falls with him, except the one standing on this side when the wall comes down." Voss looked at him for a long time, and on the face of that 60-year-old man, Claire witnessed something rarer than tears, the shame of a person being spared at the very moment he had stopped hoping for mercy. "Peter must never know anything," he finally said. "No one must know anything," Dario replied. "Now sit down, drink coffee like every Wednesday morning, and tell me what Sterling is preparing for Friday." And it was during that Wednesday morning coffee, in the voice of an accountant reading figures, that Leonard Voss spoke the thing that made the blood inside Claire, standing behind the crack in the door, freeze inch by inch. "The file on the teacher is only option 1, Voss said, both hands wrapped around the cup of coffee he had not touched. "Kane calls it the paper bullet, fired Saturday morning through 3 newspapers and 2 television stations. Sterling owns shares in. But last week after the wedding, after you appeared beside Miss Donovan in front of 300 people, Sterling met again and said the paper bullet might not be fast enough anymore, so there is an option 2. He stopped, and Claire, behind the crack in the door, saw the 60-year-old man swallow once before continuing. Her school has a fundraiser Thursday night, tomorrow night. The auditorium, parents, students performing, local press coming to take pictures. Sterling's people already have the building plans. Kane said if by Thursday afternoon you haven't given the signal that you're surrendering, then Thursday night there will be an incident there. He didn't say exactly what. He never says exactly what. He only said one sentence, and I remember it word for word because it kept me from sleeping. He said, "When a school is already about to be shut down, no one is surprised when something happens there. And once that teacher is tied to a tragedy at her own school, every financial file afterward will become nothing more than an appendix." The room went silent. Claire stood behind the door with one hand digging into the wooden frame, and in her mind there was no fear for herself, only 200 faces, the 5th grade chorus that had been practicing its song for 3 weeks. Sam and the poetry reading he had rehearsed until he knew every comma by heart, the mothers who would wear their best dresses, and she pushed the door open without waiting to be invited, making Voss jolt to his feet. But she did not look at him. She looked at Dario. "Cancel the fundraiser," she said. "We can't," Dario replied, and before anger could flare in her eyes, he went on. "Listen to me first. If we cancel, Sterling will know immediately that the information leaked. He will look for the source. Uncle Voss will be dead within 72 hours, and we will lose our only eye inside enemy territory. Worse, he will change to a plan we don't know in advance, in a place we don't control, at a time we don't expect. The fundraiser goes on, but it will take place inside a steel box. Between now and tomorrow night, I will put my people at every entrance to that building, the best people I have. No stranger will get within 100 meters, and Sterling will not move once he smells that the scene has more of my people than his. Trust me, men like him don't fight battles they are not certain they can win." "And what if you're wrong?" Claire asked, her voice sharpening. "Then I will be there," Dario said, as simply as a weather report, "in the middle of the auditorium, beside you, all night." She looked at him, searching for a crack in that logic where she could wedge her fear, and found none, so she nodded, one short nod, and the rest of Wednesday passed in the sound of Dario's phone, turning the elementary school auditorium into a fortress no parent would recognize, while Claire sat with the 2 boxes of files she had searched through to the last page 3 times, increasingly unsettled by a thought that refused to take shape. Her father had been the most careful man she had ever known. A man like that, following a murderous network for weeks, couldn't have left only one pencil note in a margin. There had to be something else, a copy, a hiding place, but where? The house was gone, the bank safe had been seized, the car had been auctioned off. Near midnight, when she had almost given up and reached for the lamp, she opened her laptop to glance at her digital lesson plans, trying to distract her racing mind. That was when the memory returned whole, clear in every detail. Her last birthday, 7 months before her father died, he had given her his old College Webster dictionary, a thick book with a brown leather cover, worn pale at the corners. It was a gift so strange that she had laughed and said, "Dad, people look up meanings on their phones now." And he had laughed with her, but his eyes had remained intensely serious. He had insisted, "Take it, keep it on your desk at school. Words can hold the things people can't, sweetheart." She had heard that sentence back then, as mere philosophy, and had kept the dictionary on her teacher's desk for the past 11 months, sitting quietly between the pencil jar and the stack of tests. It was right in the middle of the classroom, the most public, and therefore the most invisible place in the world. It wasn't in her boxes. It was still sitting on her desk at the school right now. Claire shot to her feet so fast her knee struck the table. Dario was in an emergency phone meeting in the office with the security team about the auditorium layout. She could hear his level voice behind the door. She couldn't wait, couldn't interrupt, and there was a part of her, the part that had been alone for 10 months, that did not want to wait for anyone's permission. She found Griff in the elevator hall, standing like part of the architecture. "Griff," she said, "I need to go back to my school right now. I have a teacher's key, and before you ask, this is not a midnight whim. I think my father left the thing we have been looking for these past 3 days right on my desk." Griff looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, the calculating look of a former soldier, then pulled out his phone and sent Dario one line, "Taking Miss D to the school. Possible lead. I'm with her." Then he opened the elevator door. The school at 1 in the morning was a silent black shape behind the chain-link fence, and when Claire slipped her key into the side door lock, the sound of metal rang out as loudly as a gunshot in the empty night. Griff stood between her and the streetlight behind her, eyes sweeping both ends of the block, and he spoke his first sentence since they had gotten into the car. 10 minutes, teacher, no more. Take whatever it is, ask questions later. And the door opened into the dark hallway leading toward her classroom, where the brown leather-covered dictionary had been waiting on her desk for 11 months, silent as a temple guard. Her classroom in the dark looked like an old photograph of itself. The rows of small desks lined up straight, the blue plastic bucket beneath the leak in the ceiling, and on the teacher's desk, between the pencil jar and the stack of ungraded tests, the brown leather-covered Webster dictionary lay exactly where it had lain for 11 months. Claire turned on the flashlight on her phone, covered half the beam with her palm according to Griff's signal, and picked up the book. It was as heavy as she remembered. She opened the cover, turned the flyleaf, tilted it beneath the light in search of handwriting. Nothing. She turned to the pages her father used to dog-ear. Still nothing. 2 minutes passed, then 3. Griff shifted near the doorway, and she began to hear her own heartbeat growing louder in her ears. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe that sentence had been nothing more than the saying of an aging father. Then her finger, running along the spine of the book for the 3rd time in desperation, stopped. The leather spine was harder than normal along the lower third, harder and thicker, as though something had been tucked inside. She brought the light closer and she saw it, a line of stitching, hand-stitched, perfectly even, with brown thread the same color as the leather, the kind of stitching only the daughter of a man who used to repair every torn book in the house by hand would recognize as not belonging to the publisher. "Scissors," she whispered. There were no scissors, so she used her house key, cutting through each stitch with a trembling hand, and from the narrow opening in the leather spine, something small, black, and weightless dropped into her palm, a USB drive. "We leave," Griff said, but Claire's legs were no longer listening to anyone. She sank into her own chair, pulled her lesson-planning laptop from the desk drawer, and plugged in the USB drive with fingers gone ice cold. The screen lit up in the dark classroom. A single folder appeared, named in handwriting so familiar it hurt, for Claire. Inside were dozens of files arranged by date, statements from accounts she had never heard of, dense with notes, money flow charts drawn in spreadsheet software. The path of every dollar from the city budget through 6 shell companies and back to a name highlighted in yellow at the end of every branch, Sterling Group. A 4-minute audio file of which she could only endure the first 30 seconds. The voice of a man so polite it chilled the blood. "Mr. Donovan, a careful man knows when to stop counting. You have a daughter who teaches, don't you?" And her father's voice, calm enough to break her in half. "I'm recording this call, Mr. Kane." And at the bottom of the folder, a video file dated 11 days before he died. Claire moved the cursor to it and clicked. The screen showed the kitchen of the old house, and her father sitting there in the gray sweater she had given him on some Christmas years ago, thinner than she remembered, older than she remembered. He adjusted the camera, cleared his throat, and looked straight into the lens, straight at her. "Claire, sweetheart, if you are watching this, it means I did not make it home for dinner." He stopped and half smiled, the half smile he always used when making a joke about something that could not be joked about. "I did not embezzle 1 cent. You need to know that first. What is on this drive is the truth. I checked it 3 times, you know me. There will be people who say I should have closed my eyes. I tried, sweetheart, I couldn't." He lowered his head for 1 second, then looked up, and his eyes were red. "Take it to someone strong enough to use it. Do not trust anyone at City Hall. Do not do this alone. And Claire, listen to me." He looked straight ahead for a long time. "You were never my disappointment. Not one day. You are the reason I did not stop." The screen went black. In the dark classroom, there was no sound except the hum of the laptop fan and Claire Donovan, who had not cried when wine poured down her blouse in front of 300 people, had not cried when she learned her father had been murdered, had not cried for 10 months because tears were something that had to be postponed until they became less expensive, collapsed over the nearest student desk, her shoulders giving way, and cried, soundlessly at first, only both hands pressed hard against her mouth, and her whole body shaking, then aloud, 10 months of imprisoned grief breaking loose all at once in the classroom, where she still taught children that good people would be seen. And it turned out her father had sat alone in the kitchen, knowing he was about to die, and the last thing he had done was clear his own name before his daughter, so she would not have to believe what the world said. She did not hear the classroom door open. She did not know when Griff had called him, or how the man had crossed half the city at 2 a.m. She only sensed, through the veil of tears, movement beside her. And when she opened her eyes a little, Dario Falcone was sitting down in the student chair next to her, a 6'3" man in a black coat, folding himself with absurd neatness into the plastic chair of a child of 11. And he did not hold her, did not pat her shoulder, did not say everything would be all right, did not say anything at all. He simply sat there, back straight, both hands resting on the student desk, looking toward the blackboard like the most serious pupil in the world. And there, with the whole force of his silence, he kept watch while she cried. She cried for a long time, and when the last tremors began to thin, when her breathing started to find its rhythm again, Claire understood with a clarity beyond language that through all of the past 10 months, what she had needed had never been someone to come and save her. What she had needed was this: someone to sit down beside her pain without trying to own it, a witness. "Thank you," she said, her voice still wet. "Don't thank me," Dario replied softly, his eyes still on the board. "Your father just finished 3 years of my life's work on a USB drive. The person everyone in this room should be thanking is in that video." And at that very moment, outside the classroom window, a beam of car headlights swept slowly past, licking along the wall covered with the children's drawings, paused for 1 second, then went dark. "Lights," Griff said, one single word, and everything after that unfolded in a sequence that had been rehearsed somewhere beyond Claire's understanding. Dario folded the laptop shut and handed it to her. The USB drive closed inside her fist, and they moved, not ran, moved down the dark hallway with long, quiet strides, not out the side door where they had come in, but down the stairs at the end of the corridor toward the basketball court, where the second car, the one she hadn't known had been following them all night, was already waiting behind the gymnasium building with the engine running. In the car, Griff spoke into his earpiece in the clipped slang of soldiers, and through the rear window, Claire saw the headlights of the strange car leave the school gate, follow them for 3 intersections, and then, at the 4th intersection, some night bread delivery truck suddenly stalled in the middle of the crossing, with perfect clumsiness, blocking the entire lane, and those headlights were trapped behind it, growing smaller, disappearing, without a horn, without a gunshot, only a city at night happening to have a broken truck in exactly the right place. And Claire understood that she had just witnessed violence in its most refined form, the kind that did not need to happen. No one slept that night. When they reached the penthouse, Dario handed the USB drive to 2 silent men, who arrived with equipment to copy it into 4 versions placed in 4 separate locations. And Claire sat on the sofa holding the tea Molly had made, watching Thursday dawn stain the Chicago River gray, then pink, then gold, counting down in her head, only 1 more day until Friday. But Sterling did not wait until Friday. At 7:40 in the morning, Dario's phone rang, then a second phone, then a third, and Claire watched his face slowly shift into that stillness at the bottom of a well as he turned on the television to the local news, where a female anchor was reading breaking news with the Sterling Group logo, and a portrait of Dario Falcone taking up half the screen. Businessman Edward Sterling this morning filed a complaint with federal authorities, accusing Mr. Dario Falcone, long rumored to have ties to organized crime, of intimidation, extortion, and fabrication of documents intended to sabotage the riverfront redevelopment project. The corporation's attorney, Walter Kane, stated that my client has endured the underworld's campaign of terror long enough, and any documents released by the Falcone side from this moment forward must be understood for what they truly are: an act of retaliation manufactured by the Mafia. Molly, standing in the kitchen, let out a curse no nurse ought to know. Claire sat up straighter on the sofa, cold spreading outward from her chest. "He moved first," Dario said, his voice level. "He didn't wait to see what I had. He poisoned the well beforehand. From this minute on, any evidence that passes from my hand to any agency carries the smell of the Mafia. Any judge who signs an order based on a file submitted by Dario Falcone is committing political suicide. He just turned 3 years of my work and your father's USB drive into scrap paper, not by proving it false, but by dirtying the hand that holds it." He stood and walked toward the window. 4 seconds. But this time the 4 seconds passed, and he was still standing there, and Claire realized, with a tightening somewhere beneath her breastbone, that for the first time since the night of the wedding, Dario Falcone seemed momentarily caught in a rare moment of hesitation. She set her teacup down on the table, breaking the heavy stillness her teacher's mind, the mind that had spent 4 years learning how to look at a chaotic classroom and find the one knot that needed loosening, began to move, slowly, clearly, turning the problem over like a word problem on a page. He has dirtied the hand that holds the evidence. Fine. Then the question is not how to wash that hand clean. The question is why the evidence has to come from that hand at all. Dario, she said. He turned back. He accused you, she said, each word falling slow and solid. He built his whole story around you. Mafia avenging itself against a businessman, the underworld attacking a decent man. Every gun he has is aimed in one direction, at you. But this USB drive is not yours. It has never been yours. It belonged to my father, left for me, found by me, inside my dictionary, on my desk. She rose from the sofa, and she heard her own voice steady as if she were standing in front of her class. Don't let the Mafia file the complaint. Let a teacher file it. A clean citizen, no criminal record, not $1 of tax debt, the daughter of a murdered auditor, bringing her father's last evidence to a federal agency. I am not the person accused on television this morning. I am the person his story has no script for. He spent the whole week turning you into the suspect, so we show him you were never the petitioner. You were only, she stopped for half a beat, searching for the word, a purporting source. Silence. Dario looked at her, and on his face she saw something move slowly, from shock, through calculation toward something almost like astonishment that he did not bother to hide. 3 years, he said softly. For 3 years I tried to drag him into the light with weight, money, connections, power, and the right move turns out to be stepping back and making room for a literature teacher. Not making room, Claire said, standing in the right place. You lend me your weight, I lend you the clean hand. That was the agreement from the beginning, wasn't it? We are useful to each other. The remaining problem, Dario said, already walking toward the desk, already himself again, is who we submit it to. The federal system has hundreds of doors, and Sterling has friends behind many of them. We need a specific name, someone who can't be bought. There was a soft cough from the dining table. Leonard Voss, who had arrived at 7 that morning, according to the usual schedule, and had witnessed all of it, set down his coffee cup and spoke in the voice of an accountant who had just found the missing figure. Kane is afraid of exactly one person, he said. I heard him mention the name twice, and both times he lowered his voice. An agent in the Chicago office, organized crime division, a man who refused Sterling's money 3 times in 8 years. And from what I've heard, Voss turned to look at Dario. That man once owed your brother some old favor from a long time ago. His name is Raymond Beck. The plan was sealed on Thursday morning with 3 decisions. The original USB drive and a notarized copy would be in Special Agent Raymond Beck's hands at 5 o'clock Friday morning, before business hours, before any eyes were watching, delivered by Claire herself. Tonight, Thursday night, the fundraiser still had to go on like a curtain that must not tremble, because any abnormal sign would tell Sterling that his opponents were no longer sitting still and waiting for his deadline. And the third decision, laid down by Claire without compromise, was that no matter what happened, the 200 children in that auditorium would not know, would not feel, not even for 1 second, that their performance had ever been part of anyone's plan. At 7 o'clock that evening, the elementary school auditorium glowed like a ship anchored in a dark neighborhood. Rows of folding chairs packed full. The stage hung with a paper backdrop the 4th grade had cut and pasted by hand. The word Summer Festival tilted slightly to the left, parents cooling themselves with black and white printed programs, the smell of popcorn drifting in from the rented machine in the lobby, and woven through all that ordinary life, invisible as salt dissolved in water, were 14 of Dario Falcone's people. 2 men checked tickets while wearing volunteer armbands. One father stood leaning against the back wall of the auditorium all evening, without taking his eyes off the emergency exit. 2 more sat inside the ice cream truck parked diagonally across from the gate. The rest Claire couldn't identify, and she had stopped trying. All she knew was that Griff, in the plainest gray polo shirt she had ever seen him wear, was standing in a position where he could see her at every moment. Dario arrived at 7:20, not in the Maybach but in a gray sedan no one would look at twice, dressed in dark casual clothes, and sat down on the folding chair beside her in the 3rd row of the parent section, as though it were the most natural place in the world for the most feared man in Chicago. A few parents recognized him. She saw the turned heads, the elbow nudges, but the stage lights came on just then, and the fifth-grade choir stepped out, and 200 children, along with the mothers and fathers of the poorest South Side neighborhood in the city, swallowed up every remaining bit of attention in the evening. The children sang off-key during the chorus, and no one on earth cared. Claire sat amid the applause, watching her students take the stage one after another. The lonely girl from her class playing a recorder solo she had practiced for 3 weeks and still hadn't quite mastered. The twin brothers performing a magic trick and dropping the entire deck of cards, and she felt her chest grow tight, because 18 hours ago she had collapsed crying inside this very building, and now it was filled with light and children's laughter. Both of those truths existed at the same time in a human life, she thought, and people simply had to live both of them. Then came Sam's turn. The boy walked to the center of the stage in a white shirt 1 size too large, certainly borrowed, cleared his throat 3 times, then read the poem he had practiced until he knew every comma by heart, his voice shaking through the first stanza, growing steadier in the second, and by the final line, ringing out clear. The whole auditorium applauded. The boy bowed so deeply he nearly folded in half, and when he ran toward the wings, he suddenly changed direction, rushed down to the 3rd row, and threw his arms around Claire in front of everyone. "I saw you sitting here, miss, so I wasn't scared anymore." Then he noticed the man beside her, looked up with the unguarded curiosity of an 11-year-old, having seen the broad-shouldered strangers scattered throughout the room since the beginning of the evening, and asked the question that made Dario Falcone freeze for 1 full beat. "Mister, are those men over there somebody's dads?" Dario looked at the boy, and Claire watched the man who had once made a city councilman sweat take 2 entire seconds to find an answer for a child. "They are friends of the school," he finally said, "here to make sure everything goes well tonight." Sam nodded, fully satisfied with that answer in the way only children can be, and darted away. At 8:15, during the 3rd grade performance, Claire went out to the lobby to get water for the principal, and that was when she saw him. Standing beside the donation table, dropping a check into the glass box with a leisurely gesture, was the silver-haired man from the wedding night, his pale gray suit without a single wrinkle, and when he turned, he looked directly at her as though he had been standing there only to wait for this moment. "Miss Donovan," he said, his voice smooth as coffin lining. "Walter Kane. A pleasure. I serve as legal counsel to a philanthropist interested in education in this neighborhood. What a lovely evening. Children singing always makes one believe in the future, don't you think?" Claire stood straight, both feet planted on the floor, sharply aware that Griff had shifted somewhere behind her left shoulder. "The donation box is right there, Mr. Kane," she said, "if you care about education." He smiled, the smile of a chess player complimenting a child's move. "I have already contributed," he said. "A small amount, enough to buy books, perhaps repair that leaking ceiling. Old buildings have so many things to worry about, wiring, doors, you know how it is. Old buildings are prone to trouble. Lucky there are so many people here tonight." His eyes moved slowly across the lobby, across the 2 ticket takers, across the father standing at the back of the auditorium, and Claire understood that he was counting. With so many people watching over the place, surely nothing will happen. He buttoned his suit jacket. "I wish you a peaceful evening, Miss Donovan. And give Mr. Falcone my regards. Tell him the wisest thing is for everyone to remain exactly where they belong until Saturday morning." He walked out the door, his figure dissolving into the darkness of the parking lot, and Claire stood in the lobby with children's voices singing behind her, understanding that she had just received a warning wrapped in flowered paper. She returned inside, sat down beside Dario, repeated everything word for word in a low voice, and watched his jaw harden with each sentence. "He came to let us know he can get in," Dario said softly, "and to freeze us in place until Saturday, when his paper bullet goes to press." On stage, the final school choir was lining up, 200 children, and warm yellow light covered the faces singing with all their strength. And in the middle of that moment, the phone in Dario's pocket vibrated once, short and sharp. He looked at it, then tilted the screen toward her, a message from an unnamed number they both knew belonged to Leonard Voss. Only 3 words long. "He knows now." "He knows now" meant there was no 5 o'clock morning left to wait for. The plan was moved up that very night. As soon as the fundraiser ended, 200 children were picked up by their families under an escort no one recognized as an escort. While Claire was taken across the city through 3 car changes, slept in broken fragments for 2 hours on the sofa of a safe apartment on the north side, whose address she wasn't allowed to know. And at exactly 10 minutes to 5 on Friday morning, in the ash-gray light before dawn, an unmarked sedan dropped her in front of the federal office building on Dearborn Street, where a broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair, 60 years old, his weathered face looking as though it had been carved by outdoor winters before being locked into air-conditioned rooms, was already waiting at the side entrance with a paper cup of coffee in his hand. Special Agent Raymond Beck looked at the young woman stepping out of the car with a document box in her arms, then looked at Dario Falcone stepping out behind her but stopping 3 paces away, exactly the distance of a supporting source rather than a petitioner, and his first sentence came in a voice dry as sandpaper. "Falcone sends a schoolteacher to see me at 5 o'clock in the morning. I thought life had run out of strange things to show me." "No one sent me," Claire replied. "I came on my own. He only came with me." And she looked straight into eyes that had interrogated 1,000 liars. "Special Agent Beck, my father was Frank Donovan, a Chicago City budget auditor. Edward Sterling killed him, and I can prove it." Beck looked at her for another 2 seconds, the weighing gaze of a man who had spent his life sorting truth from performance, then pushed the door open wider. "Come in, Miss Donovan." The 7th floor conference room was bright with fluorescent light, and over the next 90 minutes, Frank Donovan's USB drive opened on the large screen, statement by statement, money flow chart by money flow chart, the recording of Walter Kane, and his remark about the daughter who taught school making Beck, stop the audio and rewind it 3 times, and the video in the kitchen, which Claire watched with her eyes lowered to her hands, from beginning to end because she couldn't bear to watch it a second time. Dario submitted 3 years of his own supporting documents through his attorney, with a careful, separate chain of custody, each part kept in its proper role, and Beck took notes in handwriting that grew faster and faster, until there was a knock at the door, and a young agent leaned in with a bewildered expression. "Sir, there are 2 people downstairs asking for this meeting specifically. They say they have documents related to the same case, a young woman and an attorney. The woman says her name is Bianca Sterling." The entire room went still. Claire turned toward the door, her heart striking one hollow beat, and 2 minutes later, stepping across the threshold of the federal conference room in a cream wool coat, her hair tied low, with no makeup at all, and therefore looking younger, more tired, more human than the perfect bride from Saturday night, was Bianca. In one hand she held a silver laptop, and with the other she was almost dragging Brandon Ashcroft behind her, who looked as though he had not slept since the wedding, and had been brought here by a will that was not his own. Before anyone could ask, Bianca set the laptop on the table in front of Beck, opened it, and said in a voice so even it chilled the skin, "Special Agent, I am Edward Sterling's only daughter. On this computer are 14 months of documents I collected about my father, copies of contracts, recordings of 11 meetings, transaction logs I backed up from the family server. I began before I was engaged, and I married the attorney of a firm that processed documents for Sterling Group." She flicked one brief glance at Brandon. "Not for the reasons people have been saying. My husband brought me 2 contracts that directly contradict my father's public filings. He will give his own statement for his part." No one said anything for 5 long seconds. Then Claire heard herself speak softly. "Why?" Bianca turned to her, and for the first time since the wedding night, the 2 women looked directly at each other, without a layer of performance between them. "My mother died when I was 19, Bianca said. "A boating accident, that was what people said. 3 years later, I found her letters, and I began counting the accidents around my father. The brother of the man standing over there was one." She tipped her chin faintly toward Dario. "Your father was 2, and I understood that if I wanted to survive long enough to do this, I had to be the daughter my father trusted, shallow, obedient, agreeable. I played that part for 14 months, even at my own wedding." She stopped, and a crack ran through that perfectly controlled voice. "I was the one who sent you the invitation, Miss Donovan. I needed you there that night. I calculated that your presence would draw Mr. Falcone there, or at least make my father and Kane reveal their next move. I used you as a chess piece without asking, and the wine," Bianca swallowed. "The wine is the part I despise myself for most. Kane was standing right there watching me all evening. I needed my father and him to believe completely that I looked down on you, that I was my father's daughter, so I chose the fastest, cruelest way, in front of 300 people. I am sorry, not because I expect forgiveness, only because I want you to know that you were the price I forced someone else to pay for my war. And I will carry that for a very long time. Claire looked at that 24-year-old woman, and what rose inside her was not forgiveness. The wine stain remained intact in her memory, along with 300 bursts of laughter. Forgiveness belonged to another day, a day farther away. What rose instead was a cold, clear recognition that for 14 months, inside the largest house in the city, there had been a girl living alone among enemies, one of them her own father, with no ally, no witness, no one to sit down beside her fear. And Claire said the only thing she could truly say then, "I can't forgive you yet, but I understand now, and both of those things are true." "Enough," Beck said, rising, and the whole room moved with him. 3 independent sources of evidence matching down to transaction codes, an internal witness willing to testify. He had heard Voss through a secure line at 7 o'clock, plus the files of a dead man with clean hands. He tapped his fingers on the table twice. "I've been doing this work for 26 years, and I have never seen a case assemble itself this quickly in one morning." Then he began issuing orders and clipped commands that seemed to shake the entire 7th floor corridor. By 11 o'clock on Friday morning, the emergency petition was on a federal judge's desk. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, an emergency order freezing all Sterling Group accounts and transactions was signed. By 4 o'clock, the organized crime investigation team officially opened a new file with Edward Sterling's name on the first line, and when the sun sank beyond the Chicago skyline that Friday evening, the deadline someone had written in capital letters on the piece of paper left in the middle of Dario Falcone's desk dissolved into exactly what it had always been, paper, because Sterling's paper bullet had been loaded for a war aimed at a Mafia boss, and no one inside his machine had managed to write a script for the moment, when the petitioner turned out to be a literature teacher earning $38,000 a year, and his own obedient daughter. 2 weeks later, on a clear Tuesday morning, Edward Sterling appeared at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Riverfront Redevelopment Project with the smile of a man who believed good lawyers could delay anything long enough. He held the gold-plated shovel and posed for the press cameras on the very land that, according to the drawings, would swallow the Southside Elementary School whole. And at the exact moment the shovel touched the dirt, 4 unmarked cars turned into the construction site. Federal agents stepped out with an arrest warrant signed the night before, and the image of the real estate tycoon being handcuffed beside the rendering of his own glass towers was running on the front page of every newspaper in the city by that very afternoon. That same day, Walter Kane was stopped at a private airport outside the city with 2 suitcases and a one-way ticket with no return itinerary. People said he didn't resist. He only adjusted the button of his suit jacket and asked the agents whether they had eaten breakfast, polite to the very end, as though courtesy were a habit he couldn't give up. As for Brandon Ashcroft, because he had cooperated voluntarily from the beginning, he faced his future as a witness instead of a defendant, a mercy he would have to repay with many years of looking at himself in the mirror. The following Sunday morning, Dario Falcone went alone to the cemetery on the west side of the city, without bodyguards, without a luxury car. He stood before the headstone bearing the name Michael Falcone, 26 years old, and placed at its base the newspaper whose front page showed Sterling in handcuffs. No flowers, no candles, only the paper, carefully held down with a small stone so the wind wouldn't carry it away. And he stood there for a very long time, saying nothing, because there are debts that, once paid, do not leave a man feeling lighter, only quiet, and that silence, for the first time in 3 years, was a silence he could live with. 1 year later, on a Friday afternoon at the beginning of summer, the South Side Elementary School had not only remained on the map, but a new wing was rising from the ground, a 2-story classroom building with a library and a free breakfast room, built with funding from an education foundation named the Frank Donovan and Michael Falcone Foundation, a name Dario had originally insisted on hiding behind 3 layers of anonymous companies, until Claire discovered it and said the one sentence that made him agree to sign his real name: "Good men deserve to be named, even when they were once bad men." Frank Donovan's honor was publicly restored at a small ceremony at City Hall, where the word beginning with the letter E was officially removed from every record. The house with the white painted porch could never be reclaimed, but the name could be, and for Claire, that was enough. She still taught 6th grade, still earned a teacher's salary, still placed a box of granola bars on the corner of her desk every Monday morning. The only difference was that Sam no longer needed to steal 2 bars, because the breakfast room had taken care of that. The boy had just received a full scholarship from the foundation for the next 6 years of school, and announced before the entire class that one day he would become an auditor, like his teacher's grandfather, making Claire turn quickly toward the board to wipe away a word that wasn't dirty at all, while her students passed around a new school legend that every Friday afternoon, a black car as long as a submarine parked in front of the gate to pick up their language arts teacher, and the man who drove that car, according to Sam, who told the younger children with great authority, was a friend of our school. As for Dario, he kept the promise he had made to himself after his brother's funeral in the slowest and most naked way possible. Piece by piece, the gray parts of the business were dismantled, sold, shut down. Contract by contract, everything was pulled toward the light. Not entirely clean, perhaps never entirely clean, because a 3-generation legacy could not be washed away in one lifetime, but it was moving in the right direction, steadily, the way a person repays a long debt. That Friday afternoon, he did not sit waiting in the car as he usually did, but leaned against the door beneath the early summer sun, and when Claire walked out through the school gate with her familiar stack of tests in her arms, he said to her in a voice so solemn it was almost funny against the cicadas and the children's shouting, "Miss Donovan, I would like permission to know you more, at your pace, with no obligation and no deadline." Claire looked at the most powerful man in the city standing there, asking permission from a teacher in front of a school with a newly painted chain-link fence, and laughed. "You're asking permission again." "I find it is always effective," he replied, and at the corner of his mouth, the almost complete smile she had been watching for a year finally finished its journey. And Claire thought, the woman who had once stood in the grandest ballroom in Chicago, with someone else's wine soaking through her blouse, that what she had won in all of this had never been a rich man or a movie ending. What she had won was herself, whole, head raised, apologizing to no one for her own existence, and that was the only victory no one, and no power, could ever take away. Claire's story ends here, but its lesson stays with each of us, that a person's worth does not lie in their salary or the car they drive, but in the way they stand upright when the whole world wants them to bow their head. That true respect cannot be bought with money, and those who only know how to bow to power have never truly seen anyone at all. That truth recorded with courage will outlive the one who carries it, and justice may come late, but it will come as long as there are decent people brave enough to speak, and that sometimes what a wounded person needs most is not a savior, but simply someone who quietly sits down beside their pain. If this story touched your heart, please press like, share the video, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the compelling stories we bring to you every day. And you, how do you feel about Claire's journey? Have you ever been judged because of your circumstances? Or has someone ever quietly sat beside you during your hardest moment? Please share the feelings from deep in your heart in the comments. We truly want to hear your own story. Thank you for accompanying Claire and Dario all the way to this moment. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye and see you again in the next video.